Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for attending another Lobby for Cyprus seminar at the Hellenic Centre. We're very fortunate indeed to have two excellent speakers who really need no introduction, but I will make some introductory comments and, of course, introduce them. The title for today's seminar, the Lobby for Cyprus seminar, is Are Bicommunalism and Bizonalism Redundant Concepts in the Multi-Ethnic Cyprus of Today? Now, you've probably realised that one of our speakers is not yet here. Dr. Kyriakides is on his way. He did say he would have to be a little bit late because he is lecturing at his university. But I'm sure that those of you who have heard Klearchos Kyriakides speak will know it's definitely worth waiting for him to arrive. Now, Professor Coufoudakis will speak on the bizonal federation model and the destruction of the Republic of Cyprus. Again, we are very privileged and honoured that Professor Coufoudakis is here with us. Professor Coufoudakis is Rector Emeritus at the University of Nicosia, Dean Emeritus of the College of Arts and Sciences at Indiana University, Purdue University at Fort Wayne, and Professor Emeritus of Political Science as well. He is author and editor of numerous books and has written more than 95 journals, articles and book chapters published worldwide. His books include International Aggression and Violation of Human Rights, The Case of Turkey and Cyprus, Cyprus, A Contemporary Problem and Historical Perspective. He also co-authored with Dr. Kyriakides the case against the Annan Plan, before the Annan Plan was put forward in 2004, and it was published by Lobby for Cyprus. So again, we're very honoured to have him with us. Before we start, I'd like to say a few introductory remarks and a little bit about Lobby for Cyprus. What do we stand for? We're a non-political human rights NGO. We were formed in 1992, and since our inception, we've campaigned against the invasion, occupation, ethnic cleansing, and destruction of the cultural heritage of our island, of 37% of the Republic of Cyprus, which is occupied by Turkey. Lobby believes that being independent and non-aligned has enabled us to maintain our policies and allowed us to evaluate freely the developments concerning Cyprus without any external political forces. We were founded by a number of UK-based Cypriot refugee organisations, Ios Ambrosios, Anglo Aganthou, Lapidos and Garavas, and a number of individuals as well, including our former coordinator, Kyriakos Christodoulou. Now, that we all and they all believe that any settlement cannot and should not legitimise Turkey's illegal occupation of the northern part of Cyprus. What do we stand for? We stand for and campaign around the 3 R's: the removal of all Turkish troops, repatriation of all colonists, and the return of all refugees to their homes and lands without restriction or precondition. We strongly believe that any settlement that does not guarantee the implementation of these minimum principles will lead to a bizonal confederation, i.e. two distinct and separate bodies and self-governing bodies on the island of Cyprus. We will never accept a settlement at Lobby that will create an apartheid state in Cyprus. We campaign for all Cypriots, Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots, but we are made up of Greek Cypriot refugee associations. We want a united Cyprus that's in line with international law. One of the issues that always comes up and why we have the seminar tonight is, what does this mean? A bizonal, bicommunal federation. What do the Greek Cypriots think it means? What do the Turkish Cypriots think it means? Where are we at the moment? Well, the positives are that the Republic of Cyprus had what many agreed was a highly successful 6-month presidency that began in July 2012. So that was certainly a positive. There are obviously negatives. The banking and financial crisis that took place in the Republic, as was taking place in other parts of Europe, particularly Greece, Spain, Italy. Lost in all of this, of course, was the fact, well, some would say it's lost, that the negotiations between the Turkish Cypriot leader and the President of the Republic of Cyprus, I'm happy to say that Dr. Kyriakides is here with us now, so thank you, Klearchos. You just made it in time. Well done, thank you. Of course, the negotiations reached a stalemate in May last year, and there were a number of other factors which converged at the same time. I mentioned the Republic's presidency. Of course, Mr. Eroglu, the Turkish Cypriot leader, decided not to meet President Christofias during the EU presidency, no doubt under instruction from Turkey. Another positive was the discovery of natural gas deposits off the southern Cypriot coast. And also we've got, of course, the national elections coming up in February in the Republic of Cyprus. So all these issues converged and are converging. Negotiations may start after the elections, but Mr. Eroglu's recent statement, again, does not give us much hope. He apparently said, following the Republic of Cyprus elections, the negotiation table will be set up under the roof of the state established by the TRNC. So with that contextualization, I will hand over to Professor Coufoudakis first. Thank you.
I would like to thank you for coming tonight. I would like to thank Theo Theodorou, who, of course, is not here. He's in Nigeria. He called from Nigeria this morning. He said, "I'm sorry I cannot be present because, etc." Well, reality, traveling, I came in from Athens this morning too. Thanks to the Lobby for Cyprus for the invitation. And also, I'm grateful that Klearchos Kyriakides is with me tonight, because he and I, back in 2004, about this time of the year, had gotten together to speak against the Annan Plan. And here we are again, 9 years later, doing the same thing. Because unfortunately, those of you who believe in the resurrection, this is the case of a resurrection that we have had again in the last few months. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm also pleased to see Fanula Giroux here in the audience, because she has also devoted years and years of her life on the Cyprus issue, working the British documents, finding out details as to who did what, when, and how. She and I are in a regular email dialogue of these issues. I'm pleased that she took the time to be here tonight. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in a free and decisive, I would say, referendum back in 2004, the Greek Cypriot community, because the communities voted at that particular time, turned down a plan intended to destroy the Republic of Cyprus. That was the so-called Annan Plan version 5 that was presented in cooperation with the United Kingdom, because it was really drafted by the United Kingdom, supported by the United States, promoted by Kofi Annan, and here we are again discussing the same thing. But in a free and decisive referendum in 2004, 76% of the Greek Cypriot population rejected the plan that legitimized the partition of Cyprus, legitimized Turkey's intervention rights in Cyprus, would have expanded Britain's and Turkey's rights over a sovereign member of the EU. If you have questions on that, I'll be happy to discuss it, because one of the, if you have a plan of 9,000 pages, 9,000 plus pages, they have a little chapter expanding on the new rights that the United Kingdom would get in Cyprus years after independence, and that included the territorial waters, the subsoil of Cyprus, and the continental shelf of Cyprus, things that the 1960 agreements never included. But of course, who reads 9,000 plus pages? And in the propaganda of the UN, these things never ever surfaced. Also, the Annan Plan would have deprived all Cypriots, Greek and Turkish, of human rights guaranteed under the European Convention. And I'm going to come back to that point because it's very important. and finally would have legitimized the demographic changes brought about by the influx of illegitimate, illegal, basically, Turkish mainland settlers who now outnumber the native Turkish Cypriots by something like 3-to-1 ratio, and that's a conservative number. The Greek Cypriots on April 24, 2004, wisely and freely rejected the so-called bizonal, bicommunal federation model as the basis for the resolution of the Cyprus problem. But despite the overwhelming rejection of this unprecedented constitutional construct, στα ελληνικά εγώ το λέω συνταγματική σοφιστία. Oops, get excited. We were now once more confronted with a resurrected Annan plan in an even more dangerous version of the so-called bizonal, bicommunal federation. It is the result of nearly 4 years of talks by the outgoing administration of President Christofias and the Turkish Cypriot leadership under the auspices of the UN Special Representative Alexander Downer, a man that I knew very well when he was Australia's foreign minister once upon a time. And at that time, given that he was getting elected in Adelaide, which has a city that has a heavy Greek and Cypriot base, his views on the Cyprus problem were very different than those that he's promoting today. But that's, of course, for history to decide some other day. Anyway, as it happened in previous rounds of UN-sponsored talks since 1975, the burden of concessions has fallen on the Greek Cypriots without any Turkish reciprocity. And I want to emphasize the words Turkish reciprocity because the leadership of the Turkish Cypriot community, whether under Rauf Demirtaş, Mr. Talat or Mr. Eroglu, has failed to present its own proposals for the so-called reunification of Cyprus. Instead, Turkish Cypriot leaders have admitted that their negotiating proposals have been drafted and approved by Ankara. The accumulation of Greek Cypriot negotiating errors, and there are many, includes but is not limited to 1. The acceptance of the so-called bizonal, bicommunal federation as the basis for the resolution of the Cyprus problem, without a clear understanding of what these abstract constitutional terms entailed. Second, the failure to demand zero-based negotiations, even though Turkey repeatedly changed the basis for these talks. You know, the talks would start, they would fail, then the US and Britain would come back and say, why don't you go back again, give them something new, make one more concession, we'll get them to the negotiating table. And the history, of course, repeated itself. This is the Salamization of the Cyprus problem. You know how you take a big piece of salami and you keep slicing it? Now we're left with a tail, the very end of the salami. The Salamization of the Cyprus problem. Well, we're not cooking tonight, but that's okay. The reality is that what we have seen is the failure then to demand zero-based negotiations, even though Turkey repeatedly changed the basis for the talks. For example, two examples. In 1983, Turkey created the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus in the occupied part of Cyprus and changed the whole nature of the discussion because from that point on, it began talking about a two-state solution. And the TRNC, in quotation marks, was the beginning of promoting that particular solution. A second point, Mr. Demirtaş and his rump parliament in 1994 rejected the idea of federation as the basis for the constitutional resolution of the Cyprus problem and said very clearly that from now on we're talking about a confederation. The Turks understood very clearly the difference between federation and confederation. I'll come back to that point in a minute. The deadlocked negotiations, of course, went on. Turkey took for granted all the Greek Cypriot concessions and simply asked for more. And that's why we're in the deadlock that we're in today. Another point that I should talk about is that the Greek Cypriots, in many ways, helped downgrade the Cyprus problem from one of invasion, occupation, and continuing violations of internationally guaranteed human rights, to that of a bicommunal problem in need for a constitutional resolution. A fourth problem, that the continuation of the talks in the last couple of years went on, the talks continued in the last couple of years despite threats from Ankara to use force against the Republic of Cyprus if the Republic of Cyprus proceeded with the exploration and exploitation of its own natural resources in its own exclusive economic zone under international treaties that are part of EU law. The 3 treaties on the law of the sea are part of EU law. This is what the Republic of Cyprus did. It acted under that law. Turkey, a prospective member of the EU, refuses to acknowledge the legality of basic laws of the EU and threatened to use force against Cyprus if it went to if it proceeded with the idea to explore and eventually exploit its own resources, its own its own exclusive economic zone. Now, as if this was not enough, the previous Minister of Commerce in Cyprus was even willing to promise Turkey and the Turkish Cypriots a share of Cypriot mineral wealth despite Turkey's threat of force. These promises, of course, have now been adopted by Alexander Downer and British diplomats in order to secure a more cooperative behavior by Turkey and its Turkish Cypriot surrogates. A fifth problem in the negotiations, that the outgoing government of the Republic of Cyprus, along with Alexander Downer, promoted the United Nations mythology, and that's all it is, that in contrast to the negotiations of the 2002-2004 period, the current talks were Cypriot-owned and Cypriot-directed. This was, of course, intended to show that the resurrected Annan plan did not originate with the UN, but from the 2 Cypriot communities. So, under the direction of Alexander Downer, the Greek Cypriots continued the policy of concessions, and to the proof of that, take a look at the 26-page document that outlined the Greek Cypriot positions in the negotiations of the last 3 years, and the so-called convergence document that is dated 29 January 2012, that shows exactly where and how far the Greek Cypriot positions have moved compared to what the Greek Cypriot positions have been in the past. Of course, these 2 documents, and these are documents of the Republic of Cyprus, show the total disregard for the outcome of the 24 April 2004 referendum. They show the new and tragic concessions that have been made, which include, among others, the acceptance of the so-called 4 freedoms for Turkish nationals in the new Republic of Cyprus. Turks coming from the mainland of Cyprus would have equal rights, political, social, cultural, and everything, in the Republic of Cyprus, assuring, of course, the Turkification of Cyprus, basically. And finally, there was an attempt to attribute the new Greek Cypriot concessions to Mr. Christofias' predecessors. This has been a very funny sort of time period in Cypriot politics, where the government says, we're not at fault. We're not at fault for the economic crisis. We're not at fault for what happened in Mari. And of course, we're not at fault that we brought down the negotiating cards of Cyprus, because we didn't do it, the others did it. From Makarios to now, everybody else is at fault. Therefore, we have not done anything more than simply continue concessions. Well, this may have been true in the case of Tasos Papadopoulos, who inherited the concessions of all his predecessors, Klearidis, and before that. But in contrast to President Papadopoulos, Christofias went to the negotiation table with a new mandate. And the new mandate that he had in his hands was the outcome of the 2004 referendum. And he blew it. And now we're back to square one, because Downer, of course, is asking to return back to the talks where the talks ended a few months ago. I have to give credit to Turkey for pursuing a consistent policy on the Cyprus problem, because Turkish policy maintains, one, that The Cyprus problem was solved in 1974, meaning the invasion and the occupation of 38% of the Republic. Second, that the creation of the so-called TRNC in 1983 has set the foundation for the two-state solution on Cyprus under a confederation. This solution assures not only the partition of Cyprus, but also Turkey's control over all the island. Another point, there is a demand to end the so-called Turkish Cypriot isolation, even though this so-called isolation is the direct outcome of the Turkish invasion and continued occupation. But it is used today by Turkey to bring about the de facto recognition of the occupied areas. And that's exactly what that process of so-called lifting the embargoes and all that, the isolation, intends to do. And of course, Turkey demands that continuously the Turkish troops remain on the soil of an EU member with expanded intervention rights even after the resolution of the Cyprus problem. Turkey has been clear and consistent. The problem is with the Greek Cypriot side that it has not been, and has been fluctuating from A to Z and accepting things that it rejected before and accepts now. Nobody takes them seriously. As anticipated, the latest round of talks ended in deadlock, and I'll comment very briefly on this issue. One, the acceptance of talks on the basis of the Anglo-American model of the bizonal bicommunal federation amounts to the acceptance of the legitimized partition of Cyprus that Richard Holbrooke demanded of the Greek Cypriots in his mission to Cyprus in May of 1998. I do have that document, his talking points, in my own files. That's one of the precious items that I have. A second point, the bizonal bicommunal federation model is an unprecedented constitutional construct created by the British, promoted by the Anglo-American diplomacy, especially after the 1977 Clark Clifford visit to Cyprus. It is an unprecedented constitutional construct that has now been incorporated in UN Security Council resolutions drafted by British diplomats at the Security Council. All the resolutions on Cyprus begin at the British mission at the UN. Then the Americans get into it, and then the final product is produced every time they renew the mandate of the UN peacekeeping force, and they include all the various points, the political resolution of Cyprus. Now, it is somewhat ironic that while during the Cold War, England and the United States fought hard to keep the Cyprus issue off the UN agenda, since the end of the Cold War, the two countries have relied on the UN Security Council to promote the bizonal bicommunal federation model as the only legitimate solution of the Cyprus problem. A third point, supporters of the so-called bizonal bicommunal federation have not read carefully Lord David Honey's book on Cyprus. In a most cynical manner, David Honey describes how he and his American counterparts relied on the words are wonderful, constructive ambiguity, okay? With the intent to pretty much mislead the Greek Cypriots about their real intentions and the real meaning of the proposals that they were submitting on the Cyprus negotiations. The bizonal bicommunal federation construct is unprecedented, it is dysfunctional, it is divisive, and it is discriminatory. This is why Alexander Downer is coming back to do the same thing that was rejected in 2004. In reality, the bizonal bicommunal model promotes a confederation of two autonomous states on Cyprus. None of the versions of this model presented by Kofi Annan back then and now by Downer and Ban Ki-moon provide for the hierarchy of laws that is normally found in federal constitutions. Federal constitutions in most critical areas give primacy to federal law. In the case of the model promoted for Cyprus, as in all confederations, the central government is a subordinate governmental unit to the two constituent states. This is what they're trying to do today in Cyprus. Finally, and most importantly, the bizonal bicommunal federation, in any of the models presented until now, is in direct violation of the European Convention on Human Rights, a treaty which is the fundamental law of the European Union. This unprecedented constitutional construct is based on discrimination on the basis of ethnicity, language, and religion. This is explicitly prohibited under Article 14 of the European Convention. And needless to say, both Turkey and the Republic of Cyprus have ratified the European Convention. As a law-abiding member of the EU, the Republic of Cyprus must not and cannot accept a constitutional construct that violates the very essence of the rule of law and democracy. Period. Where do we go from here? Especially when Cyprus is headed to presidential elections less than a month from now. Two of the three major presidential candidates talk in terms of a bizonal, bicommunal model with, quote, a proper content. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there is no proper content in a discriminatory model intended to destroy a 53-year-old republic. This model can only lead to the Turkification of Cyprus, to the partition of Cyprus, and to the violation of the human rights and fundamental rights of all Cypriots under the European Convention. Pure and simple. You are here tonight because of your concern about the future of the Republic of Cyprus and of Cypriot Hellenism. Do not be fooled by the sirens promoting the bizonal bicommunal federation model as the model for the reunification of Cyprus. This model will destroy the Republic of Cyprus and formalize its partition. This is the latest manifestation of the plans that have been floating around on Cyprus since the spring of 1964. First with the NATO plan in February, March of 64, the Acheson plans of summer and fall of 64. Since then, these are the plans that have dominated how to destroy the Republic of Cyprus. In 2004, Cyprus avoided its own destruction. The challenge today is to do it also now. Remember that there can be no just and viable solution that violates the rule of law and democracy. If Cypriots do not stand for this very basic principle, no one else will. Freedom, democracy, and the rule of law are fundamental principles required for the survival of Cypriot Hellenism. Cypriot Hellenism will not survive by appeasement, by concessions to Turkish expansionism, and by attempting to please foreign powers. No self-respecting country would accept to destroy itself to please third parties. So if they wouldn't do it, why should we expect the Cypriots to do that? Very plain, simple, rational question. With a sense of responsibility then for the future of Cypriot Hellenism, reject all plans presented under that unprecedented constitutional construct of the so-called bizonal, bicommunal federation, a construct that mortgages the future of Cypriot Hellenism to Turkey's neo-Ottomanist ambitions. Thank you very much.
Dr. Kyriakides, Klearchos Kyriakides, his paper is entitled The Rule of Law Vacuum, Ethical Deficit and Contradictions at the Core of the Cyprus Question. Very pleased to have Klearchos with us again. Klearchos Kyriakides is a senior lecturer, non-practicing solicitor at the School of Law at the University of Hertfordshire. He's also an executive member of the Hertfordshire Law Society, the West London Law Society, and the Society for Modern Greek Studies. He's also a former research fellow at the erstwhile Royal Air Force Staff College and a past president of the West London Law Society. He holds a degree from the University of Birmingham, MPhil and PhD in international relations degrees from the University of Cambridge, and a postgraduate diploma in legal practice from the University of Westminster. As I said earlier, and as Professor Coufoudakis said, Dr. Kyriakides also co-authored the case against the Annan Plan in 2004. He needs no introduction. We're very happy to have Klearchos with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Costas. First of all, can you all hear me?
I have to apologise for arriving late, but at least I've arrived. And I must also, at the very outset, congratulate Professor Coufoudakis for visiting us and for his contribution to scholarship over the decades. One of my first experiences as a student was to pick up a book written by him, and I've been influenced by his ideas and scholarship over the decades, and I'm particularly honoured to be with him this evening. I'm grateful to Lobby for Cyprus for inviting me to address you once again. I must begin with my usual caveat, which is to the effect that what I have to say this evening represents my own views and not the views of any organisation. The title of my contribution is The Rule of Law Vacuum, Ethical Deficit and Contradictions at the Core of the Cyprus Question. The phrase, the rule of law deficit, was used by the Secretary General of the United Nations without expressly referring to Cyprus when he referred to the rule of law vacuum as a concept which was evident in so many post-conflict societies. The rule of law is a principle of cardinal constitutional importance which lies at the very heart of the Commonwealth and the European Union, of which the Republic forms part. It is also a cardinal principle of the United Nations. Ethics is a concept which owes its philosophical origins to the great book of that name by Aristotle. And Aristotle hovers large in the story of Cyprus. One of the points he makes in his other great book, Politics, is that a constitution can easily be drafted and it can quite easily last for a day or two. The problem is that constitutions have a tendency to fall down, and the objective of any constitution-making process should be to ensure that a constitution lasts beyond the first day or two of its existence. Contradictions at the core of the Cyprus question will become evident as my talk proceeds. I want to do two things in the limited time I have available. The first thing to do is to outline some salient points of history and principles of law which govern the and relate to the Cyprus question. And secondly, I want to zoom in on the origins, perceived rationale for, and risks associated with these twin concepts, bicommunalism and bizonalism. My central argument is that both of these concepts are anachronistic, philosophically unsound, morally dubious, and legally questionable. Let's begin now with a little bit of history, which you should hopefully be familiar with. Actually, I'll come back to that later. The history of Cyprus, of course, goes back into antiquity, but the starting point for the modern era is, of course, the Zurich-London agreements, which were effectively imposed upon Cyprus as a non-negotiable precondition of partial decolonization and independence. And remember that the Republic of Cyprus came into being subject to the terms of various treaties which gave rights to two of the former imperial rulers of Cyprus, Turkey and the United Kingdom, together with Greece. But what I want to zoom in on now is the concept of bicommunalism, because the 1960 Constitution, which was effectively imposed on the Republic, was predicated on bicommunal lines. So the bicommunal element of the bicommunal bizonal mantra owes its origins in the modern era to 1960, although it owes its historical origins to the Ottoman imperial era. Bicommunalism is an Ottoman constitutional concept. I'll say a little bit more about that later. But it's very important at the very outset that we identify those core principles. This is a map that's drawn from the official website of the United Kingdom Ministry of Defence. It's in the public domain. It's Crown copyright material. And you will notice from the map that the United Kingdom does not regard the Republic of Cyprus as de jure partitioned. It regards it as a unitary state, as indeed it is under the 1960 arrangements. The United Kingdom, as we know, asserts sovereignty over 2 sovereign base areas and regards the island of Cyprus very much as a British base. And Prince Harry returned from Afghanistan via Cyprus earlier this week. The operations in Afghanistan and possibly the discrete ones in relation to Syria are using Cyprus, one suspects. But that's very important by way of background. So the Republic of Cyprus did not come into being as an independent sovereign state in the normal circumstances one finds in Europe. It came into existence subject to concrete binding, although that's questionable in a moral sense, and extensive, let me rephrase that, forgive me, came into existence subject to extensive rights claimed by Greece, Turkey, and the United Kingdom. Did not come into existence free from the shackles that that other countries were free from. I'm going to move on, if I may, to the familiar history of the 60s and the 70s. The Republic did not join NATO. It chose in its wisdom to join the non-aligned movement. This exposed it to the tensions associated with the Cold War. In the 60s, we saw the intercommunal clashes, the constitutional crisis, and the acts of external interference, which marred the early years of the Republic's existence. And as a consequence of the activities, it must be said, of paramilitary organizations from all the communities in Cyprus, or the 2 main communities in Cyprus, if we can use that phrase, which I'm going to later attack, the rule of law was not properly bedded down. Even though the Republic was nominally established as a democracy, the rule of law, as we understand it in the European liberal West, was not embedded. The gun prevailed to a great extent. Politicians thought they were above the law, and external actors in the region behaved as if the law didn't exist. And then we had the Turkish invasion of 1974. And I'd really want to just read to you something from an English Court of Appeal case. Nothing annoys me more when I hear politicians here in Westminster use weasel words to avoid drawing attention to the reality of what occurred in 1974. Politicians, because they don't want to offend Turkey and they want to play the diplomatic game, love referring to the events of 1974, the episodes of 1974, the conflict of 1974. The English Court of Appeal, in common with a number of English judges, has chosen to call a spade, and in the case of Polly Peck and Marangos of 1998, a case in which the Marangos company lost on a point of law, the Court of Appeal stated that in the summer of 1974, Turkey invaded the island of Cyprus. By the 16th of August 1974, Turkey had occupied a large area in the north, amounting to just over 1/3 of the whole island, which the Court of Appeal referred to as the occupied area. And many members of the Greek Cypriot community in the occupied area fled in fear of armed force from their homes and businesses to the other parts of the island. Now, it was implicit in the use of the words invasion and occupation in that particular court case, and others, which I won't go into, that Turkey had violated international law. It had breached the terms of the United Nations Charter, which prohibit the use of force, save in very limited circumstances, to do with the right of self-defense or with the authority of the Security Council, which didn't apply in the case of Cyprus. Turkey cited the Treaty of Guarantee as the justification for its invasion, but even if one accepts the Turkish argument, the Turkish armed forces acted in, to use the Latin phrase, ultra vires, beyond their powers. The Treaty of Guarantee only permitted Turkey to take action with a view to restoring the constitutional order established in 1960. Turkey went beyond its powers and thus acted unlawfully by either physically uprooting the refugees and displaced persons or constructively expelling them from their properties. Turkey had, as the European Court of Human Rights has confirmed, breached the terms of the European Convention of Human Rights by procuring the de facto segregation of the Republic of Cyprus. Turkey breached the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, 1965. Interestingly enough, whereas Greece, the United Kingdom, and the Republic of Cyprus had signed and ratified that 1965 Anti-Discrimination Convention by 1974, Turkey had only signed in 1972 and had not ratified the convention at the time of the invasion. Turkey didn't get round to ratifying that convention until 1994, if I remember correctly, well after the invasion, and even then it ratified subject to the terms of a declaration, the effect of which was that the terms of that anti-discrimination convention would not apply to states with whom Turkey did not have diplomatic relations. In other words, the Anti-Discrimination Convention of 1965, Turkey asserts, does not apply to its occupation of the north of Cyprus. Now, look at the date, 1965. That was a convention that was introduced against the backdrop formed by the Holocaust during the Second World War, in which Jews were subjected to discrimination of the most repugnant kind. It was also formed by the backdrop of events in the southern states of the United States and the civil rights movement. It was also formed by the backdrop of South Africa and the apartheid there, and the assertion of white rule in Rhodesia. So Turkey had violated the International Convention on the Elimination of Forms of Racial Discrimination. Turkey had also breached the terms of the Treaty of Guarantee by occupying the north of Cyprus and procuring a de facto partition. The Treaty of Guarantee prohibits partition. Within days, and I've looked at some of the declassified documents as well, within days of the invasion, Turkey had started bringing Turkish citizens over from Turkey to the occupied area to populate the occupied area. That was a breach of the Geneva Conventions of 1949. Shall I go on? There's one more breach that's worth noting. Turkey endorsed the purported declaration of independence by the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus in 1983. Turkey was the only state to recognize that UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence, and that, as the United Nations Security Council confirmed, was a breach of international law, and more specifically a breach of the 1960 treaties. So for a multiplicity of reasons, Turkey violated the law and was unable, therefore, to secure a de jure, a lawful partition of the Republic. That sounds like somebody's... Unless my voice has activated something.
You might have a spy in on it.
So that's all by way of background. And I want to make one very important point here, and I'm conscious of the time. Why did all of this law come into existence? Look at the dates of those conventions. The Charter of the United Nations, 1945. Geneva Conventions, 1949. The Convention of Human Rights, 1950. The Convention Against Racial Discrimination, 1965. These were the implements of international law which were designed to prevent a recurrence of what had happened on the continent of Europe during the 1930s and 1940s. And I might add, bearing in mind Asia Minor and the forthcoming exhibition on Smyrna here, which you should all attend if you're available, that what had occurred in the First World War and in its aftermath in the 20s. These were introduced as a riposte by the victorious Allies to illegality and as a means of championing the rule of law. Let me just illustrate that telling point with reference to France. Now, France is traditionally kept out of Cyprus, but with the Eurozone crisis, it's now looming ever large in the domestic politics and diplomatic context of Cyprus. What did the Germans do in 1940, shortly after the declaration of war? Germany invaded France. Large numbers of French citizens were displaced from their homes. They became refugees, to use the layman's expression. The Germans carved up France into zones. The occupied zone in the north, the coastal military zone, which was largely free of citizens, the so-called free zone, which was governed by the collaborationist regime of Marshal Pétain, the lawful government of France, of course, represented by de Gaulle and others, was in exile. The Italians occupied a zone in the southeast, and in the east of France, the Germans not only expelled the local population, but they annexed the territories and also established what they called a zone of German settlement, which was intended to be populated by German citizens in an exercise of the Nazi policy of Lebensraum. You can see the parallels here, and they're eerie. And the word zone, of course, was concocted by Dr. Kissinger and later adopted by Kurt Waldheim. And Dr. Kissinger, of course, is a Jewish emigre from Germany. But one imagines, and I don't know what was in his mind when he came up with the idea of zonality in the mid-70s after the invasion, but one cannot help thinking that he had the activities of Germany in mind during the Second World War when they invaded countries and established zones. And he perhaps also had post-war Germany in mind, which had been carved up into zones asserted by the Soviets, the Americans, the French, and the British. So this idea of zonality has the Second World War as its historical basis. And you'll also notice, and hopefully you've picked up on this, the other parallels with Cyprus. The occupation of territory, expulsion of the lawful residents, and the importation of settlers. That's why those laws exist, because France, being one of the 5 victorious powers and one of the 5 leading members of the Security Council, permanent members of the Security Council, was able to contribute to the affirmation of the rule of law in the aftermath of the Second World War. And I'm now coming to Cyprus. As we know, it's now carved up into 5 segments. The Republic of Cyprus, areas occupied by Turkey, the areas of the Republic which are not occupied by Turkey, the buffer zone which cuts across the middle, and the 2 sovereign base areas. So Cyprus has been carved up into 5 segments. Now we come to the second part of the concluding part of my analysis, which is to zoom in on bicommunalism and bizonality and the contradictions at the heart of the Cyprus question. The Annan Plan was defeated, partly, I think, because of the combined efforts of Professor Coufoudakis and I, and the help of the Lobby for Cyprus. We played a small part in the defeat of the Annan Plan. And as a consequence of that, in spite of the defeat of the Annan Plan, the Republic of Cyprus acceded to the European Union in 2004. And it joined the European Union free from the constraints, restrictions, and other provisions in the Annan Plan. And as a consequence, every citizen of the Republic of Cyprus, in common with every other citizen of the European Union, belongs to an organization which is flawed, as we all know. It's in some respects undemocratic, but on paper at least, it is an organization which is founded, and I quote here from the treaty itself that governs the European Union, it's founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities, because minorities are as entitled to protection as majorities. There's no discrimination permitted, especially on racial grounds, within democratic states such as the one that we have in the European Union. And these values are common to the member states of the Union in a society in which pluralism, not racial domination as occurred in Nazi Germany, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality between women and men prevail. And the Union is also predicated on the basis that there should be free movement of peoples and free movement of goods, and there should be freedom, security, and justice without internal frontiers. So the Republic of Cyprus joined subject to these noble values, which represent a response and a riposte to what the Germans had been doing in Europe during the 30s and 40s. And remember, the French were one of the 6 founding fathers of the European Union, and they were very much behind this as a project to prevent a recurrence of the First and Second World Wars. The snag for Cyprus is that in their neighbourhood there are countries which do not share the same values. And even though the Republic of Cyprus legally joined this organisation and legally adopted these values, the culture of the Republic of Cyprus has been very much influenced by its imperial past and by its geographical proximity to the Middle East. And nothing demonstrates this better than the observations of General Özkök, the commander of the Turkish Armed Forces, in a speech he gave at the Turkish War College on the 20th of April 2005. I took this from the website of the Turkish Armed Forces back then. It's now been pulled from the website of the Turkish Armed Forces for some reason. But this is what the general said in 2005, a year or so after the accession of the Republic to the European Union. In terms of the national interests of Turkey and the responsibilities given to her by international agreements, Cyprus represents one of the main issues about which our concern shall never decrease. The importance of Cyprus from a security point of view is based on 2 fundamental principles. One of these is the security responsibility which we have to ensure for our Cypriot kinsmen, and the second is the importance of the strategic role that Cyprus plays in terms of the security of Turkey, as allegedly, he claims, expressed in the treaties of guarantee and alliance. Now, the whole point of the European Union and the whole point of having a democracy under the rule of law is that people are protected by the law as enforced by independent courts. The mindset of our region in the Eastern Mediterranean is that people are protected by a gun. And regrettably, that mindset has influenced the Turkish Armed Forces. By extension, it's influenced the Turkish government. And by extension, it's influenced, regrettably, the Republic of Cyprus. Because instead of embracing those noble values in the Republic of Cyprus, they have succumbed to the culture of the region and have entered into a negotiation process which is predicated on 2 principles, bicommunalism and bizonalism, which are completely contradictory to the noble values of the European Union. And let me now, in the final part of my talk, just illustrate to you why they are completely antithetical. This is what has been agreed by President Christofias wearing the hat he was given as Greek Cypriot leader, according to the United Nations, in his joint statement it published. This is what President Christofias agreed with Mr. Talat in 2008, whilst he was wearing his hat as Greek Cypriot leader. It's a subtle point there, but it's worth grasping. The leaders today reaffirmed their commitment to a bizonal, bicommunal federation with political equality as defined by relevant Security Council resolutions predating the accession of the Republic to the European Union. that this partnership will have a federal government with a single international personality, as well as a Turkish Cypriot constituent state and a Greek Cypriot constituent state, which will be of equal status. So the two pillars of this model are bicommunalism and bizonalism. I've already made the point that bicommunalism owes its origins to the Ottoman imperial era, but it has two or three features which are antithetical to European values. The first feature is the one that was articulated by Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, in 1958. Bicommunalism results in administrative partition. So even though the Republic was established in 1960, it was partitioned administratively according to the terms of the Constitution. And this is what the Annan Plan and whatever they've been cooking up in secret is being built on, administrative partition. In 1958, Fatih Zorlu, the then Turkish foreign minister, stated that bicommunalism also produces a kind of intellectual partition. What he meant was that one community cannot dominate the other community. But what it also means is that the language that's used in the context of Cyprus is infected with bicommunalism. So we hear everybody, politicians, diplomats, ordinary citizens, referring to the two sides, as if citizens could be carved up into two racial groups. The two communities. The Turkey refers to the two peoples, hopefully they think, as a stepping stone to self-determination for the Turkish Cypriot community. The bicommunal programs. In this country, we've got used to the principles of equality, diversity, and pluralism. What could be contrary to the principles of equality, diversity, pluralism, and I might add, inclusion, than bicommunal programs? How would an Armenian feel if he saw a bicommunal program on education aimed at Greek and Turkish Cypriots? How would a young Syrian Cypriot, who's the son of a refugee from Syria but has a Cypriot passport, feel if he saw a program aimed at Greek and Turkish Cypriots? How would a Russian child with a Cypriot passport feel in that context? We have a population in the Republic of Cyprus now which contains a migrant or non-Cypriot refugee population that has reached 18%, according to the latest census. 18% of the population, the lawful population, I should add, of the Republic of Cyprus consists of non-Greek Cypriots and non-Turkish Cypriots. This isn't the Cyprus of the 60s and the 70s, when bizonalism and bicommunalism were all the rage. We're talking about a completely different entity. The Lidra Street in Nicosia is like Holloway Road. And I see people nodding. How are we going to integrate the new migrants, the refugees from Syria, the refugees from Afghanistan, the Pakistani lad who's lived there for 10 years and has picked up a passport? How are we going to integrate these people if we are trapped by the intellectual partition of bicommunalism? And I want to finish by 5 minutes? Another 5 minutes. That's what's wrong with bicommunalism. It's contrary to the very pillars of European identity. Of course, Professor Coufoudakis worked for many years in the United States. The Americans have the same pluralist culture. That's why President Obama has now become president for the second time. These aren't necessarily European concepts. These are liberal democratic concepts which we in this country benefit from. Mr. Frangeskides is a partner in one of the biggest firms of solicitors in the City of London. His name, Frangeskides, hopefully, has not counted against him or in his favour. He's reached the pinnacle of the legal profession by virtue of his credibility as a lawyer, his education before he qualified as a lawyer, and his character. Professor Coufoudakis reached the pinnacle of the university system in the United States by virtue of his character, his qualifications, his credibility, his scholarship. Not because he was called Coufoudakis or because he was Greek or any other factor that's unnecessary. The Annan Plan, as the 1960 Constitution functioned, was predicated on people reaching positions of power because of their race or religion. This is completely anathema to modern European principles. So enough, I've said hopefully enough on bicommunalism to demonstrate how dangerous it is. But let me now close with bizonalism, because this is the most chilling feature of this concept. Can you see the signs there, by the way? I'll come back to those signs right at the end. But that is a sign of the ethical deficit at the heart of the Cyprus question, and it's also a reflection of how everybody has just accepted it. The United Nations, the Republic of Cyprus, the other guarantor powers. I showed that to my colleagues at the university today, and they were horrified. But what makes bizonalism most chilling of all is the approach that Turkey has taken towards it. If I can just take you to the next page. Now, Turkey uses oblique terminology. That's diplomatic terminology to describe bizonalism. Turkey states that the Cyprus question must be settled on the basis that restrictions will be placed on three freedoms: freedom of movement, freedom of settlement, and freedom of property. Of course, that goes against every principle of capitalism, goes against every principle of the European Union, goes against every principle of living in a liberal democracy under the rule of law. We are all, those of us who are European Union citizens can go anywhere in Europe to buy property, open a business, trade, and so on. What's chilling about bizonalism is how Turkey interprets it behind the scenes. Now, I've thought long and hard about drawing upon WikiLeaks, but I'm going to draw upon WikiLeaks because there's one document that reveals the essence of bizonalism. And this is a document prepared, it seems, by the American ambassador to Nicosia, but it was certainly issued, according to the WikiLeaks document, it was issued by the United States Embassy in Nicosia and transmitted to Washington, D.C. And if I've got this correct, the meeting was attended by the United States Ambassador in Nicosia and Mr. Sakir Fakili, the so-called Turkish ambassador to the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. So they had lunch, and this is what diplomats do after they have lunch. So if you ever go for lunch with a diplomat, remember it will be probably recorded and sent off somewhere. They had lunch, and the ambassador went and wrote down what he thought of the meeting, without knowing that it would end up in the Hellenic Centre in Marylebone a few years later. On bizonality, a key Turkish Cypriot demand, Mr. Fakili, this Turkish diplomat from Turkey, thought there would be no residential mixing of Turkish and Greek Cypriots post-solution. He quickly clarified his comment, knowing that he said something he shouldn't have said. He quickly clarified his comments, however, stating that there would be ceilings that limited Greek Cypriot settlement in a future Turkish Cypriot constituent state. Note, our pro-solution Turkish Cypriot contacts, both in Talat's office and in the so-called Minister of Foreign Affairs of the TRNC, claim that Turkey wants as ethnically pure a Turkish Cypriot state as possible, even if this means giving up more territory in return. All I can do in response to that is draw to your attention to what Martin Luther King said before he secured the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Segregation ends up relegating persons to the status of things. Hence, segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, it is morally wrong and sinful. Dr. King campaigned against the signage and the culture that was prevalent in the southern states of the United States, as one can see from that sign that's been published by the United States government. That's a sign in Georgia in 1943. The middle sign is from apartheid South Africa, and it's used in educational materials published by the United Nations. And the sign on the right tells Greek Cypriots to turn left and Turkish Cypriots to go right. I understand at the Lidra Palace checkpoint, which is maintained by the United Nations. Segregation is not just morally wrong, it's unlawful. It's contrary to the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination, racial discrimination. You can read the provision in your own time, but it states that the parties to the convention particularly condemn racial segregation and apartheid and undertake to prevent, prohibit and eradicate all practices of this nature in territories under their jurisdiction. I'm approaching 9 o'clock, so I will just draw your attention to additional provisions of European law which reinforce and build upon what the 1965 International Anti-Discrimination Convention stated. Article 1 of Protocol 12 of the European Convention of Human Rights 1950 came into force as recently as 2005. This provides that the enjoyment of any right set forth by law shall be secured without discrimination on any grounds such as sex, race, colour, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, association with a national minority, property, birth or status. No one shall be discriminated against by any public authority on any grounds such as those mentioned above. And Turkey, by the way, has not ratified that convention provision. And the European Union's Charter of Fundamental Rights establishes a similar principle and says that everyone is equal under the law, and as a consequence, all those forms of discrimination are unlawful. And that, of course, forms the backdrop to the bill currently going through Parliament, which will ensure that if Prince William's first child is a daughter, that daughter will inherit the throne of this country, because we've decided as a country to move on from the discriminatory practices of the past. So, hopefully I've demonstrated here the bankruptcy, the moral bankruptcy and the legal questionability of bizonalism. I'm now going to close, ladies and gentlemen, and draw your attention to some fundamental principles and then offer 2 or 3 thoughts before we throw things open to discussion. I began by referring you to Aristotle's Ethics, but in his other book, Politics, he reminded us that man, when perfected, is the best of animals, but when separated from law and justice, he is the worst of all. And Aristotle in Ethics reminds us that the law is not just a cold, blunt instrument. The law must be associated with justice. And this is what they can't understand in Cyprus, I regret to say, the political class at least. They think that whatever they cook up in secret will be lawful because it will represent the law. But Aristotle and the Western liberal tradition reminds us that the law, to quote an American judge, must float on a sea of ethics. And this is the theme that Martin Luther King picked up, because the law in the southern states of the United States permitted that racial segregation. The law in South Africa permitted those signs to be put up. The law in Nazi Germany was inherently discriminatory against Jews and Gypsies and others. And in the European Union, as part of the Western liberal tradition, we've decided that the law should not be whatever the politicians say it is, but the law should be inherently just and ethical and moral. The second concluding thought is from our own Lord Chief Justice in this country, Lord Judge of Draycott. Lord Judge was born in Malta to a Maltese mother during a German air raid. His father was English. He came over to this country. He educated himself, became a very senior judge, and is now the most senior judge in this country. He is Lord Chief Justice and head of the judiciary. He reminds us that where the rule of law ends, tyranny begins. It is an adaptation of the great phrase of John Locke. And it's interesting that the President of the Supreme Court of this country is Jewish, Lord Neuberger, and the Master of the Rolls of this country, Lord Dyson, is also Jewish. And the Lord Chief Justice, who is the head of the judiciary and the top judge, is Maltese by birth and by his mother. You can reach the top in a multi-ethnic society irrespective of your background, and that is how the Cyprus question should be resolved. It should be resolved on a multi-ethnic, unitary, democratic basis that's predicated on the rule of law. And I've mentioned the Jewish background of those two judges. My eye was caught by a rather interesting statistic. In 1966, there were no more than 30 Jews on the island of Cyprus. Today, there are approximately 2,000. Since 2005, Cyprus has had its own chief rabbi, its own synagogue, even its own supplier of kosher food. The Jewish community is expanding. I understand for various reasons. One is that there are Israeli citizens who are coming over for business purposes. There are British, French, German citizens who are leaving Germany or France or the UK and going to live in Cyprus. And interestingly enough, as I understand it, from what I've heard anecdotally, there are some Israelis who are eligible for a Polish or a Lithuanian or an Estonian passport in view of their backgrounds and connections to those countries. And they're picking up their passports from the Lithuanian embassy or wherever it is, whichever European Union embassy it is, and they're hopping over to Cyprus to escape the conflict the conflict with the Palestinians, but to stay within the region. That community is growing. How can we be talking about two communities? We must surely be talking about one community under the rule of law. One community with several languages, with Greek and Turkish perhaps enshrined in the Constitution as the two primary languages, with Islam and Christianity given certain rights in certain spheres. But we shouldn't build the Constitution around Christian Greeks and Muslim Turks. And this reminds us of what Anthony M. Kennedy, the United States Supreme Court Justice, said. When we talk about the rule of law, we assume that we're talking about a law that promotes freedom, promotes justice, and promotes equality. Justice Kennedy is Roman Catholic. The President of the United States is Barack Obama, and he is of mixed race background. And earlier this week, he was inaugurated to become the president for the second time, and he said a few things that I'd like to read out to you today to close my contribution. And these are the guiding principles I would submit that ought to be planted into Cyprus to replace bicommunalism and bizonalism. Each time we gather to inaugurate a president, we bear witness to the enduring strength of our constitution. We affirm the promise of our democracy. We recall that what binds this nation together is not the colours of our skin or the tenets of our faith or the origins of our names. What makes us exceptional is our allegiance to an idea articulated in a declaration made more than 2 centuries ago. And it was a declaration, I might add, that was influenced by the ancient Greeks generally and by Aristotle in particular. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I can do no better than close with President Obama's words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Klearchos.